One word has been circulating around Twitter and online surrounding football recently, and in some talks with some teams like the Arizona Cardinals. That word is tanking. If you don't know what tanking is when a team purposely loses or does bad in order to get a higher draft pick and get a guy in the draft. Hint, hint, Caleb Williams this year. So you have a dude that, hey, we need to make sure we're bad because we need to get this dude so we lose on purpose. Now, the NFL does not like tanking. No league likes tanking. So, what rules does the NFL have against tanking? Right now, the NFL has a competition committee that looks into teams and can determine whether teams they think are being competitive. And it's a committee that determines these things on their own and then they come up with punishments. In the rules of the NFL, it specifically states a team cannot offer to pay a player or coach, and no player or coach may receive any bonus, money, or thing of value for winning any game played in the league. So basically, they're saying this comes from you can't pay someone to purposely lose a game or do any of that kind of stuff because they do not want teams purposely losing. We've seen the NFL is being really strict on competitiveness and fair play in the game. We've seen with the best thing to look at is all the gambling stuff that's happened lately. The NFL is slamming the hammer down on gambling when it comes from Jamison Williams to Isaiah Rodgers and some of the other Colts players. They do not want gambling among players and anything that can mess with the game and its competitiveness and fairness. And so tanking is one of those things that they don't want to mess up, especially when people they're starting to get really strong connections with all these sports books and gambling. They don't want the backlash that comes when people are gambling on these games and there's teams purposely losing. That just does not bode well. So let's go ahead and first, before we talk about what's kind of going on this year and the accusations being thrown around online, I want to look at what has happened in the past for tanking in the NFL and what has happened to those teams. The first example of tanking that I have is in 2022, the NFL looked into Hugh Jackson and the 2016 Cleveland Browns after Hugh Jackson claimed he was being offered incentives to lose from ownership for the Cleveland Browns. The league did not find any evidence of anything specifically that happened. Goodell came out and said a couple things, and inadvertently, Goodell kind of basically said it's okay to pay a coach for winning a certain number of games, and it's okay to pay a coach to accrue more draft picks, and it's okay to pay coaches more for spending less. Those were things that Goodell didn't have an issue with it because there was rumors that basically Hugh Jackson would be paid more the less they spent on the roster, and he'd be paid more the more draft picks that they were to accumulate, which is kind of weird because that doesn't seem very competitive to spend less on the roster, but yet Goodell kind of said it's okay. The Browns ended up getting the number one overall pick after this season of tanking that was accrued, and they were able to draft Myles Garrett at number one, which I think worked out pretty well for them. That was the first kind of case of tanking. And then we go into 2022. This was probably the biggest tanking thing we've had in the NFL. And that was in 2022. The Miami Dolphins lost two draft picks, including a first round draft pick in 2023, which just happened, and a third round draft pick in 2024, along with a $1.5 million fine. And this was a double combination of a punishment. It was part to do with tampering with Tom Brady. There were accusations that they were doing some illegal tampering with Tom Brady, but then also the big part of this was for tanking. After Brian Flores, the coach for the former head coach for the Miami Dolphins, was fired, he came out and there was a lot of stuff that was weird going on. I'm not going to get into all of the injustice that was happening and that he claimed, but what I do want to talk about is the tanking aspect in which Flores told reporters after he was fired that he would get paid $100,000 for every game that he lost. Now that is pure tanking. Like if that is true, which I'm not here to say what's true now, I'm just here to say what has been put out into the world. if that was true, then that is straight up tanking because you're paying a dude to lose games, which is directly against the rules of the NFL. And as much as the owner was able to deny this and they didn't find specific evidence that this was true, they would still end up getting that first round pick, which is a huge penalty, a first round pick and $1.5 million in fines. They also had accusations thrown around the Dolphins that the owner repeatedly suggested to coaching and the team that they should prioritize draft position over winning their final games in 2019. This whole season and the whole tanking was the whole tank for Tua that you probably remember from 2019. They end up getting the number 5 pick in that draft and still getting Tua, but there was a lot of stuff from the reported $100,000 for losing the games to the prioritizing draft position. The NFL took this seriously. Like, so they combined it with the Tom Brady tampering, so it's not just purely this that lost them the picks, but that's a pretty big penalty, a first and a third and a $1.5 million fine. So this is the first thing we've kind of seen of, hey, the NFL is going to be taking this seriously. So teams better tread carefully if they want to even think about tanking, because the NFL is not playing games with it. And then 2 other smaller examples I have is the 2021 Texans have been accused of tanking. They hired David Culley for 1 year to go 4-13 in a year that Watson was suspended for. So Watson was not playing this year. I can't actually remember. I put down that it was suspended. It was either his suspension year or the year he sat out. It was one of those 2 years in 2021. But I think it was his suspension year. But so they hired David Culley. Actually, he wasn't suspended, so it would have been the year he sat out. They hired David Culley. They go 4-13, and in that year, you might be wondering, yeah, they just had a bad year. They fired David Culley after 1 year, which is already kind of weird. It's like, why do you hire a dude with an awful roster, do bad, which is kind of expected with that roster, and then fire him? But you might be wondering, yeah, okay, that's all well, but like, what did they do? Let me go over the moves that this team made and why people accuse them of tanking. They lost J.J. Watt. They let him leave for Arizona. They basically sold Mark Ingram for a 7th-round pick in a trade. They let Will Fuller walk in free agency that year. They let Zach Cunningham, after signing to a big deal, they waive him. He was their middle linebacker. After signing a deal, they waive him, get rid of him. They released Whitney Merciless, who was one of their best players at the time. That all led to them getting the 4th overall pick and drafting Derek Stingley, which I think is a really good player, and I think it's going to work out. But that was another team that was accused of tanking after making those moves, hiring David Culley, firing for a year. Like I said, I'm not here to say if they tanked or not. I'm just here to say what people have thought could be construed, that's a big word, as tanking. The last example I have is nothing has ever happened for this, and I don't think anything ever will, because it's not necessarily tanking, but as an Eagles fan, I know what we were doing. And in 2020, the Philadelphia Eagles in Week 17 had no reason to win. They were slotted for a top 10 draft pick. Jalen Hurts had just started the 2 games before as his first 2 starts, kind of getting his feet wet. Doug Peterson in his last year. And they went into the last game of the season playing Washington Commanders, who were a team that had to win to make the playoffs. And the Eagles were sitting in a position, this was a late night game where basically if they win the game, they draft at what was like pick 11 or 12. If they lose, they pick at pick 6. That's a big difference. As we can see later on, the Miami Dolphins traded a future first-round pick to move up from 12 to 6. So you're talking the difference of a first-round pick between winning and losing a game. The Eagles played Jalen Hurts for a little, and Jalen Hurts, keep in mind, have been playing pretty well. He torched the Arizona Cardinals. He beat the Saints before. He'd been playing well. They benched Jalen Hurts for Nate Sudfeld in that game, along with pulling some of their starters in a Week 17 game, which could be looked at as tanking to the Commanders to get a higher pick in that, in which they got pick 6, traded back, grabbed an extra first. So you could say they almost tanked for an extra first-round pick, is what some could say in that situation. So that's an interesting thing. Now, those are good examples in the last couple of years of tanking. So why are people saying that the Arizona Cardinals are tanking? Let's go ahead and look at what the Arizona Cardinals have done. So they, obviously, Kyler Murray had an ACL injury last year and is expected to miss a good portion of this year. So they're already struggling a little bit in that situation. And then it really started when they traded Isaiah Simmons, which I understand why they traded him, because why they wanted to move on. He's in his 5th year. He'd been struggling. He just didn't seem like he fit on that team. You could see the talent, but maybe just the fit wasn't right. But they shipped a former top 10 overall pick, Isaiah Simmons, for a 7th round pick. That was already like a little, whoa, okay, a 7th round pick. Then Colt McCoy, who was basically penciled in to be their starter while Kyler Murray was out, was just released. He just got released. And then they trade for presumably who's going to be their starting quarterback, Josh Dobbs, who's been a career backup. It's not like, oh, Josh Dobbs, is this young, exciting Trey Lance kind of guy. Like, we've seen Josh Dobbs. He's a good, solid player, but we know what he is. And they trade for him to be their starting quarterback, which is, okay, so you trade a top 10 pick for a 7th round pick. You're getting nothing back in return. And then you just release Colt McCoy. Did like nothing about like no QB battle, no trade for an asset. They just release him. Trade for Josh Dobbs. And you're thinking, okay, that's a little bit fishy, but it's not really tanking. The Cardinals are a good organization. There's been some questionable stuff with the Arizona Cardinals lately. Like they lost a draft pick for tampering with Jonathan Gannon. And the one thing that kind of questions this is I see a similarities between this situation and reason why I mentioned the 2021 Texans earlier is because I see a lot of comparisons. They get rid of all these players. Texans, they lost J.J. Watt, traded Mark Ingram, let Fuller and Cunningham walk. They hired David Culley to let him go after 1 year. Could Gannon be in a similar situation? Bringing Gannon in, a guy who's going to bring publicity to the team. He's already done a lot of that. So there's questions there. I'm not going to say that the Cardinals are tanking because that's a huge accusation. And I don't think they're tanking, but I do think there is strategy behind trying to get a higher draft pick. And now you're wondering, okay, why are we tanking? It's for this dude right here. Caleb Williams. Dude is a dog. Like, if we're 2 weeks into the college football season, I'm filming this Sunday, September 3rd, after he played Nevada. And there's multiple times every game where I literally watch Caleb Williams and, like, I'm just laughing out loud watching a football game because this dude just does stuff that's, like, not even fair. Like, you probably see the highlight here of San Jose State. He fumbles the snap, runs behind, flick of the wrist 60 yards down on a dime completion. Next game against Nevada, he jumps out of bounds and flicks the ball 60 yards on a rope to his receiver. Like, he does stuff that is not, I don't know if Caleb Williams is a human being. I think we might need to do some tests whether or not he's been working with Elon Musk and has the chips in his brain and stuff, because this dude is not a human. Caleb Williams is on a different level, and he's a dude that all NFL teams are going to be wanting. And a dude that is going to make this draft interesting to see if someone wants to make a move for him. But not only that, there's a lot of good quarterbacks. I think Drake May is incredible in this draft class. He's going to be good. And then you have a humongous group of so much upside, from J.J. McCarthy to Michael Penix to Bo Nix to Riley Leonard to Michael Pratt to Quinn Ewers to Jordan Travis. I mean, this is one of the deepest quarterback classes that I can remember. And there's just so many dudes in this class that I think it's going to be an incredible quarterback class, and you're going to see some teams do some things to position themselves for a quarterback. And part of why I think this trade deadline might be really interesting this year, because teams, that are struggling the first half of the year might end up trying to ship off some really good players at the trade deadline to kind of position themselves for a quarterback. I'm thinking like guys from like Cooper Kupp to Mike Evans to even like a dude like DeAndre Hopkins who just signed. If some of these teams start to struggle, I could see some really good players being on the move. And with all this tanking and with this interesting year and a guy like Caleb Williams, whether or not we think a team will actually tank or not, has people questioning what the NFL can do about this and if there's any real solutions, because you've seen like the NBA, there was some really bad tanking in the NBA. You saw it's most prominent with the process in the Philadelphia 76ers, and these things lead to a lottery in the NBA and a question of whether or not the NFL would ever do a lottery or a top 10. There's been ideas floated around about different ways, whether or not, you have like a tournament at the end of the year for the bottom 5 teams to play for the number 1 pick, or you do a lottery, or you base the top 10 off of like winning percentage, do it like the opposite. There's a lot of ways people think you go around tanking, but I just want to give you guys the rundown on tanking and why there's these accusations being thrown around, some of the history. Let me know what you guys thought, and I'll see you for the next video. Thank you so much for watching.